SFBBO, promoting sustainability by engaging communities for more than 40 years. Our Birdy Hour speaker series is a free virtual program. On April 9th, 2024, Dr. Daniel Karp gave a talk about his work to harmonize biodiversity conservation with agricultural production for our community.
We'll launch into all the stuff that I've been doing over the last few years here at UC Davis. So I'm actually from the Bay Area originally. I grew up in the East Bay, started birding when I was like 8 years old, and then went to undergrad down by you guys at Stanford. After my first year at Stanford, I went up to Klamath Bird Observatory and I learned to band birds up there. And when I was done with that, I wanted to continue practicing a little bit. So I actually did some volunteer work, volunteer banding throughout the next year at SFBBO. So that would have been like, 2007 or something like that. So got to come out to the Coyote Creek Station and hang out a little bit out there for some years, coming out every once in a while and catching birds. So finished up that undergrad and then continued to be in California. I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that I did after my undergrad as a postdoc, kind of jointly with the Nature Conservancy and then also with UC Berkeley. I was there for a couple of years before heading up to the University of British Columbia, where we set up some of the work in Costa Rica that I'll talk about today. And then after that, I came back down to California. So aside from that year and a half in British Columbia, I've always been within like a 2-hour kind of radius of where I grew up. And now I'm at Davis. So yeah, at Davis, I've been here since 2017. Our lab focuses kind of on impacts of agriculture on wildlife. We do a lot. Most of our work is with birds. The other SFBBO connection I've got is my new graduate student who just started a couple months ago in the fall is Julian Titoni, who some of you guys might know. And we've designed a really cool project that's going to actually be a partnership with SFBBO. And he's going to be doing some banding and collecting some data that's kind of aligning with stuff you guys are doing and PRBO or Point Blue now is doing as well. So some nice connections and kind of new ones bubbling up as well. Okay, cool. So that's me. But I want to talk to you guys kind of about the stuff that I do today. So let's start off. Let's kind of start off with a global view on conservation. So right now, protected areas, so think of these as like nature reserves, national parks, things like that, they cover around 15% of Earth's land surface. Maybe it's closer to 17%. And that's a decent number. It's been growing over the past decade, so that rate of increase slowed a little bit over the last decade. Now, it reflects our knowledge as conservation scientists that one of the best ways to kind of prevent this biodiversity crisis we're in is to set off these areas where we don't deforest as much, where we don't hunt, try to protect these areas. But that amount of Earth's surface pales in comparison to the amount of Earth's land that is covered in agriculture, which sits somewhere around 40%. It's a combination of cropland and rangeland. And for a very long time, biologists, conservation scientists ignored agriculture. They thought of agriculture like this picture. This is from one of the study systems I work in Northwest Costa Rica. It's a sugarcane plantation, basically stretching off as far as the eye can see. You wouldn't expect to see very much, not much wildlife, not much birds in a place like this. But here's another picture. This is actually where I was working on my dissertation back in the day. This is in southern Costa Rica. And I'd like to take you through a few aspects of this picture that make it really different from the prior one and might try to convince you that there would actually be some scope for conserving birds and other wildlife in a landscape like this. So first to note, in this area, there is one protected area. It is the Las Cruces Biological Preserve. It's a glorified forest fragment. It's only 230 hectares in size. And yet, when viewed from above, about 35% of the area still exists as tropical forest. It just exists as these small patches of forest going along riparian strips, maybe larger patches in the back, all on private land that these landowners are maintaining. You'll also note that there are these lines demarcating the different plot boundaries. These are hedgerows or live fences, is what they're often called down in Costa Rica. And just like up here in California, we know that these are really great for pollinators, um, also good for birds as well. And then you'll also note that it's not just one crop like that sugarcane in the previous picture. We have some, banana in the foreground. We got a little patch of that over in the back too. We see intercropping with coffee right here, a big patch of coffee in the back as well. There's a little pasture over on the left. So together, this is what I would call a much more diversified farming system. And I think it's in these kinds of systems that we might see a lot more scope for conserving birds alongside us in these farming landscapes, right? And that's what I focused on for a long time in my career. In my kind of earliest work, I was working with some data from Costa Rica. I was comparing these diversified farms and forest reserves and intensive monocultures, the difference between those diversified farms and those intensive monoculture, one crop farms is exactly the difference between those two pictures that you saw, right? One crop stretching as far as the eye can see would be the monoculture. And what you can see here is on the x-axis is just time, number of years going by, right? And on the y-axis, we have the number of bird species that were surveyed in these transects all across Costa Rica. And what you can see is at least locally on the farm, you saw about as many species in the forest reserves as in the diversified farms. They were pretty equivalent. That was stable over time, but almost half as many in the intensive monocultures. So this is just one example. And all of these birds are specific examples of birds, that can really thrive alongside us in the right kind of conditions. And there's lots of other examples of studies like this. So for example, another really cool one that I love is the work by Lisa Schulte Moore, who's a professor at Iowa State. And she's shown that adding these prairie strips of native tall grass prairie into the really intensive corn, soy landscapes of the Midwest can just do wonders, right? So 10% of your crop field, a narrow strip in this native tall grass prairie can bolster, flowering plant abundance and diversity fourfold, 9 times more pollinators, 4 times more birds, twice as many species. Lots of benefits in terms of biodiversity, also benefits in terms of kind of retaining nutrients, preventing erosion, things like that. And indeed, there's been a long recent push to focus not only on all the biodiversity that could be found on these kinds of farms, but also on the benefits that farmers might get from having this biodiversity around them. So the pollinator people, for example, have shown that if you have more habitat around your farm fields, you get bees and other pollinators coming onto your farms, pollinating your crops and increasing your yields. And that's a big deal. About 1 out of 3 bites of food that we all eat comes from an animal pollinated crop, including the ones that are sort of the most nutritious and important from like a, micronutrient perspective. I work a lot on pest insects and the natural enemies, the predators of those crop pests. And we've also recognized for a really long time that we can take advantage of those natural enemies and use them to control the pests in our fields. So tracing back, into ancient times, thousands of years ago, in China, orchard farmers would cultivate these weaver ant nests and place them throughout their farms, throughout their orchards to control fruit fly infestations. And that's a practice that continues up until today. So we know that managing some of this biodiversity in our farms could actually benefit the farmers themselves. All right, so I'm beginning to give you this picture of this beautiful story for farmers, right? We have, these practices that might promote more biodiversity on the farm, and it might provide the farmers with benefits, more yields, controlling their pests, all of this. What I want to do today is push on this idea a little bit and ask ourselves, is that too rosy of a picture? Right? Is all of that work that I was doing early in my career, is it a little too optimistic? Do we need to rein it in a little bit? And specifically, I want to ask, all right, we know there are a lot of species on these farms, but what kinds of them are they? Are they the kinds that we care about from a conservation perspective, for example? And we'll focus on birds in Costa Rica for that question. Then I want to ask, all right, maybe there's a lot of species on the farm now, but what's going to happen in the future? What's going to happen with climate change as the world gets warmer and warmer? Are we going to continue to be able to have this wildlife alongside us in these agricultural farming landscapes, or are we going to need to do something different in order to safeguard them with climate change? And then lastly, I talked to you guys a little bit about the benefits of having birds or other species on farms. Well, what about costs? We're going to refocus, we'll move from Costa Rica to California, and we'll ask questions about what birds are doing on farms. Are they eating the pests like we want them to, or are they damaging our crops, eating our strawberries? Are they spreading foodborne diseases like E. coli and salmonella? We'll talk about food safety a lot today too. So tall order, a bunch of different stuff spanning different parts of the world, and we'll try and make our way through it. All right, so starting off, what kinds of species can persist in farmland? All right, so for this work, we were working in Northwest Costa Rica. This is a really cool area of Costa Rica. It's by kind of Palo Verde National Park. It sits right here. And we were working in this area, Costa Rica, for a while. We were monitoring birds on 20 farms and 5 protected areas for 5 years. And really importantly, we were working across what we would call a precipitation gradient. That just means we had sites that were near the coast where it was a lot wetter. And then as you move inland, same elevation, same temperature, it actually gets a lot drier though. So we've got this gradient from the wet coast to the dry interior. And we have all of these sites in black, which are the farms. On those farms, we had sites where we were counting up birds in the privately owned forests and then also in the agricultural areas. We also had 5 reserves in blue here, 5 protected areas. At each of those sites, we had 6 places we were counting up birds using these point counts. You stand in a given place, you look 50 meters around you, or you listen 50 meters around you for 20 minutes and you count up all the birds you see. And then we use some fancy statistical models that help us account for variation in our ability to detect birds in different kinds of situations and deal with that. That's all I'll say with all the statistics stuff. All right, so what do we find with this kind of thing? Well, the first thing we want to look at is kind of similar to the prior stuff. How does the local habitat, whether you're in forest or in agriculture, how does that affect the amount of birds we're seeing in these point counts? So on the x-axis here, we have the amount of forest cover. On the left right here, 0%. This is a 100% agriculture farm here. On the right, 100%, this is in probably a nature preserve. And what you see here is as you increase the forest cover, you tend to get more bird species. It peaks at around 80% forest cover locally within 50 meters. But the increase is kind of marginal, right? It shows that in a lot of these farms, you actually get, nearly 30 species locally in these places where we were counting up birds. So that's again telling us that agriculture can maintain bird diversity, at least locally on this farm scale. But really importantly, we want to care not just about how many species we have, but what kinds are they? What is the composition of what we would call these bird communities, right? That's the question that I said we should set out and answer. And in fact, we found that the birds that live on forests and farms are really different. And this means that not all species are going to thrive in agricultural settings. Specifically, when we look at about the 150 birds that we would count up in this area, Northwest Costa Rica, we find that about 30% of them are really restricted to forests, like this long-tailed manakin here, very emblematic of Northwest Costa Rica. And you're not going to see it in the middle of a crop field. About 25% of them are found pretty exclusively in agriculture. So like crested caracaras here, you see them a lot more in the middle of an agriculture field than in the middle of a tropical forest. And then about 44% of them were generalists, where you'd actually find them both in forests and in agriculture. So we get these different kinds of birds in different places, right? In agriculture versus in forests, right? So what kinds of species are they? Are they the ones we care about from a conservation perspective? Well, in Northwest Costa Rica, there aren't actually that many species of sort of, global conservation concern listed on the IUCN Red List. There's a few that we counted up, but not that many. A good measure, though, for sort of thinking about their global conservation importance is their range size. So are they restricted to a small area within Costa Rica / Central America, or are they really widespread? And so what I can do is I can look at all the birds that I see at any given place at those different places, and then just calculate the kind of average range size of all those birds. And what you see here on the left of the graph, these places that are really agricultural, you see a lot more birds like this guy, the great-tailed grackle, which ranges all the way from, South America and Colombia and Ecuador through Costa Rica, and has actually been expanding its range, and now is a bird we regularly get in California, and you guys will see around in San Francisco and up here in Davis as well. So big-ranged birds. On the other side of this graph, you see birds like this. This is our long-tailed manakin friend again, and this is a bird that obviously has a much smaller range, much more restricted to Central America. So a lot of those narrow-range endemic birds, the ones that we care about more from a global conservation perspective, are a lot more forest restricted. Now, I could spend a lot more time talking about this, about like exactly other attributes of birds that are in forest versus in agriculture, but I'm actually just move on right away to the next question and thinking about how these birds are going to persist into the future with climate change, because we've got so much to cover today. So in order to think about this, remember, we've got this precipitation gradient, right? We've got these sites that were close to the coast where it was wet, and in the interior where it's dry, okay? That's really important because while it's really tricky to figure out what's going to go on with precipitation and climate change in lots of places around the world, in this area of the world, we know that it's going to get drier. All the climate models sort of agree with this. So we can kind of look and see, all right, what's going on with the dry versus the wet sites now as kind of an indicator of what might happen in the future. And what we found was something really interesting. How a bird responds to agriculture is super highly correlated with how it responds to drying. So what we're doing here in this graph is we're kind of, every one of these dots is a different bird species, about 150 of them, remember? And the ones to the right over here are birds that are at much higher abundance in agriculture, and these ones are at lower abundance in agriculture, higher abundance in forest. On the y-axis, we have how they respond to that precipitation gradient. So towards the top, birds that do really well where it's dry. Towards the bottom, birds do well that it's wet. So for example, we've got a bird like the stripe-headed sparrow here, and it tries to do well in agriculture and in dry places. On the other hand, our long-tailed manakin, again, that's a bird that does well in forests and in wet places. And so there's this really correlated response here where the dry forest birds are dominating agriculture. Okay. And that's really important, right? Because as I said, Northwest Costa Rica is experiencing drought and is going to experience more drought into the future. And so when we sort of project how the bird community is going to do in the future, we actually find that climate change will probably favor these agricultural birds and threaten the forest birds a bit more. And that matters, right? Because as we see more habitat conversion to agriculture and we see climate change, we see both of these major pressures on wildlife sort of favoring the same group and then threatening those same group, including those narrow-ranged endemic birds that we might care about a lot. All right, so why in the world are these dry forest birds so abundant, more abundant in agriculture? We don't really know, but I can venture a guess. And I think it actually has to do not with precipitation, but with temperature. So we know that forests shade the understory from heat waves, right? You guys are in San Francisco or the South Bay where it doesn't get very hot. You have your nice climate all year round. I remember when I was at Stanford, it's fine all year round. I'm in Davis during the summer. I am always either under a tree or in air conditioning, right? It's freaking hot and birds are like me, right? Maybe they look and they need those areas that are, shaded when it gets really, really hot out. Dry forests, though, in the drier areas, they're more open. They have shorter trees and they provide less shading. So we put out some temperature loggers here. And what you can see here is our precipitation gradient. So on the left, drier sites, about 1,500 millimeters of rain a year. And on the right, we have the wetter sites. You can see that in agriculture, there's really no difference between a wet site and a dry site. They're all fairly hot. That's what on the y-axis, right? But in forests, it's different. In the dry sites, the forests and the agriculture are about the same temperature. But in the wet sites, the forests are considerably cooler than agriculture, likely because they're, shading the understory and providing a lot more of that shade, that thermal buffering. So it could be that maybe the species that are sort of pre-adapted, that evolved in these drier locations were pre-adapted to deal with agriculture's hot temperatures. Maybe. That's an idea we have. But regardless, all of this stuff got us really interested in these ideas about heat waves and how they would affect agricultural species versus forest species, and kind of redirected our lab a bit to really start thinking about climate change and habitat conversion in agriculture all at once. So to get at this question about heat waves in agriculture, we actually turned to a really cool citizen science data set, a community science data set called Project Nestwatch. Maybe some of you guys have contributed to it before. This is organized by Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They've got all the best, citizen science stuff going on over there. But this data set is just really cool. After we filtered it down and had all these qualifications for whether an observation would count or not, we had 150,000 nesting observations of 58 bird species across the US. And very few studies have actually been published out of this remarkable data set. So we kind of felt like we hit this treasure trove with not that much science done on it. 37,000 sites across the US. And there are sites in forests, in agriculture, in more natural open areas like grasslands, and in developed places like, residential yards and in cities, right? And so what we did was we extracted all this information of people going out and monitoring nests and saying what's the bird and is the nest successful, did they fledge young or not, got all that information, figured out what the dates were, and we calculated the temperatures during nesting. And what we were really caring about were actually something called a temperature anomaly, and that is just how hot is it during nesting compared to what it would have been sort of historically at that site at that time of year. Was it hot for that site at that time of year? Was it cold? Was it average, right? I can't just compare, a bird in California, in Davis to Sacramento, because what's hot for Davis is very, very, very hot for Sacramento. What's hot for San Francisco, what's hot for San Francisco is not that hot for Davis, right? So we calculate these anomalies. And what we found was, as you increase these temperature anomalies, so these are nesting attempts that experience really hot temperatures here on the x-axis. What you see is that in forests, the probability of fledging offspring actually increased. Birds did better when it's hotter in forests, but in agriculture, they showed a really big decline. And this is just all birds in general, when we break them down according to their sort of level of conservation concern here, so think of a relatively declining species like an oak titmouse, oak woodland associated birds declining, versus on the other end of the spectrum are like invasive house sparrow here. When we break them down by conservation concern, you see that the more threatened a bird is, the bird of higher conservation concern shows this trend even stronger. So a real strong increase in forest and a real big decline in agriculture. When you also break it down by the types of nests they're building, unsurprisingly, birds that build nests that are sort of open cup nests, as opposed to a bird that's building their nests in cavities or in nest boxes that might be more insulated from the temperature spikes, those open nesters were more vulnerable. So this is telling us these temperature spikes are disproportionately affecting birds in agriculture, and maybe it's because of the shading that forests might give, right? So our ongoing work is seeking to understand why. Why is it that these heat waves are affecting birds more in agriculture? One of the things that my grad student Katie Locke is doing is she's working with nest box birds in around Davis, putting out all of these nest boxes and orchards and row crops, and also riparian forests and grasslands, and then capturing birds at the nest box, collecting blood samples, and using that to try and figure out stuff about their stress physiology, and then also having cameras mounted to figuring out how often they're visiting their nestlings. So maybe it's too hot, they're visiting their nestlings and providing them less food. Maybe there's the direct effect of heat on birds, and we can see that in their stress levels. We also have a project, my other grad student, Cody Pham, who's working actually on Napa Valley vineyards. And he's thinking about how birds move and select different places to go and what they eat when temperatures get hot. So he's got these 20 vineyards he's working across in Napa Valley. Half of them have nest boxes, half of them didn't have nest boxes. We added boxes to the ones that didn't. It's part of this bigger project looking at pest regulation. But he is able, for the first time, really ever in this context, to tie how birds move using these GPS transponders on really small birds to changes in temperature. And so last year, he had his first year of data. He tracked 75 bluebirds and tree swallows. He's about to go back out into the field Monday to start it all up again. And we've got sort of preliminary, really cool data that looks like this. This is an example of a bluebird, right? So this is a bluebird on a vineyard. You can see this is this is June 1st last year. The average temperature between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. that day was about 29 degrees Celsius, and the bird is sort of found throughout the vineyard. Next day, same bird. You can see the average temperature got a little bit hotter. Now it's 32 degrees Celsius, and the bird is a little bit closer to this natural habitat here, and then also this little hedgerow. Next day, even hotter, and look where this bird is. So maybe we were able to figure out where they're going when it's hot. We're collecting their poop to figure out what they're eating, using DNA analyses to do that. So a lot of really cool stuff that we're teasing apart right now. All right. So what have we got so far? We've got what kinds of birds persist in these farmland. We know they're different species than the ones that are in forest reserves. We also know that they might be vulnerable to these temperature spikes looking into the future. So we might need to think about providing shade for them. Now what I want to do is think a little bit about what these birds are actually doing on the farm and what that means for the farmer. And for that, I want to tell a little bit of a story. So let's kind of go back in time a little bit. Back in 2006, there was this really big outbreak of E. coli in bagged spinach, right? It made the national news. 200 people or more got sick. A couple of people actually died. Since then, there's been a lot more of these outbreaks, so it's still more relevant up until today. But this was a really important one. The offender, this pack of Dole spinach, was traced back to the California Central Coast, so Monterey, San Benito counties, where most of the leafy greens for the United States is grown. And in particular, was found on the strain that caused this outbreak was found on one farm, and it was found in the soil and in the water, but then also in the feces of cattle and wild pigs. And the wild pigs were the kicker, because it led industry to believe that wildlife were bringing these foodborne diseases onto farm fields. And since then, there's been incredible pressure on farmers to do everything that they can to keep wildlife away from their farm fields. So what does that mean? What does that look like in California nowadays? Well, agriculture has actually fundamentally changed since that, especially, fresh produce agriculture, things you would consume raw, like, lettuce or spinach or strawberries, things like that. Now we see rodent traps lining the field edges. They might be filled with, snap traps like you might use in your attic, or anticoagulant rodenticides. You see tons of fencing going up. Most of the Salinas River is now fenced to keep out the deer and the pigs. That might have some implications for wildlife movement and corridors. And then most critically, what I'm going to be talking about today is habitat removal. So right after the outbreak, there was all this pressure on growers to remove habitat around their farm fields. In fact, about 13% of the remaining riparian habitat in the Central Coast, along the Salinas River and things like that, was removed as a direct result of this outbreak. And it's a practice that actually continues up until today. So a survey we did, 10 years after the outbreak of nearly 600 California produce growers, 40% of them reported clearing vegetation to create these bare ground buffers around their farm fields and try to prevent wildlife from getting onto their farm fields. Really importantly, this is often not a grower's decision. They have to do this. This is because their buyers think like the really big corporations out there will send auditors to their farm fields and tell them, you remove this habitat or we won't buy from you. And so their entire livelihood is threatened. So what I wanted to do when I first started working in California was basically see, all right, this is a practice that's really widespread. is it effective? Like, is it doing what they want it to do? Is it reducing foodborne pathogens? So I managed to convince a large leafy greens organization to give me access to an unbelievable data set of 240,000 tests for enterohemorrhagic E. coli and actually salmonella in leafy greens. EHEC is the kind of E. coli that gets you sick. It had 74 farms in it from the year 2007, right after that outbreak, to 2013. We also had a data set on indicator E. coli. So this is generic E. coli in water, in wells and waterways. Doesn't necessarily get you sick. Some people think it correlates with pathogenic E. coli. Some people doesn't. Whatever. We have the data, 7,000 tests on 480 farms. So the simplest thing that we can do is we can ask, all right, what does the landscape look like around a farm? And did that place test positive or not for pathogens? So here's a farm. The sampling location is in pink right here, and we can classify the area around. We can look at the amount of cropland. We can look at the amount of the riparian habitat or other natural habitat, and then also grazed lands. Grazed lands really key because we know E. coli, pathogenic E. coli came out of animal feedlots, and there's lots of associations between that and pathogens, all right? So what did we find? Well, sure enough, if we look at the grazed lands, you see that there's a positive effect. This is above zero, a positive effect of the grazed land on the likelihood that any leafy green is going to test positive for E. coli. No effect of cropland. For riparian and other natural habitat, you can see the predicted effect is actually negative, but these lines cross zero, so we can't really say anything with confidence there. So no effect of the riparian habitat or the other natural habitat, and if anything, it would be a negative one. Also, no effect of the ungrazed habitats on E. coli and water, and no effects on salmonella. But what was even cooler was, remember, this data set is temporal, meaning that, we had data over time. So we could ask, are the farms that are removing more habitat experiencing more or less E. coli over time, right? And so that's what we have here. On the x-axis, we have negative numbers because we see reductions in habitat, removal of habitat over time. Over on the left, these are farms that remove more habitat. And on the y-axis, we see the change in E. coli. You can actually see these are mostly positive, so increasing incidences of E. coli over time here. And what do we see? We see that the farms that actually remove more habitat, if anything, are experiencing an increase in pathogenic E. coli, the exact opposite of what they would want, right? You might be squinting at this point up here asking, is this driving everything? If you remove it, this is still a significant trend, but there's a lot of scatter here. So what I like to do when I talk about this with industry and growers and things is say, all right, whether or not, natural habitat is good for reducing E. coli, maybe there's debate about that. But you certainly can't take this line and flip it and make it a positive line, right? And that's what you would need to see in order to see that this habitat removal is working. And if anything, we are seeing habitat removal increasing these food safety risks. So we did that work, and we didn't really know why, though, right? Like, it could be that, the habitat removal is not effective, but wildlife is still a problem. It's just that removing that thin strip of habitat is not enough to change their movements onto your farm or not. And in fact, farmers are really concerned about wildlife, and they're concerned in particular about birds. Here's a quote from a farmer that I worked with in the Central Coast, and it's part of some surveys that we did, some interviews. And this farmer said, the thing that worries me more actually are birds. You can't control birds, and they're constantly like flying over your field, and they come and they sit in the field and they carry salmonella, right? And so sure enough, we do know birds can carry these foodborne pathogens, but how much of a risk are they? What kinds of birds are a risk? What can we do about these risks, right? So that's what we set out to kind of look at, and what we've been looking at over the last few years. So the first thing to do was to get some data together. So we got some data that we had been working on, and then also some other studies that had been working on the Western US. And we got actually 11,000 tests of pathogenic E. coli, of salmonella, and then also Campylobacter. That's another kind of disease that can get you sick. 90 produce farms, 95 bird species that were tested for these pathogens, all right? We also have a data set on bird surveys on farms, about 1,500 point counts conducted across 350 sites to see what kinds of birds are coming onto the farm and interacting with the produce. And then finally, we had this database of about 500 poops of birds. We've subsequently repeated this, so we've got a lot more now, but 500 poops that we collected from the farms, and we're able to identify which bird was the culprit that pooped that poop by looking to see what was the DNA in that poop. All right, 35 farms. So first off, very, very rarely do you see pathogenic E. coli or salmonella in these birds. 0.2% for S-tech, for the E. coli, 0.5% for salmonella, just vanishingly rare. For Campylobacter, it was more common. 8% of birds tested positive. Really big caveat here, whether this is the same strain that gets people sick is still really heavily debated. There are forms of Campylobacter that are sort of native to bird guts, all right? So still, we can at least do some statistics with this because we have 8% of the birds sort of testing positive for it. And we found that if a species was associated with livestock, if you sometimes see it, in a field that has, or in a confined animal feedlot or in rangeland or things like that, then the species was more likely to carry pathogens like Campylobacter, come in contact with produce, and defecate on crops. Interestingly, birds that ate insects, however, including these nest box birds that we might put out nest boxes to attract insect-eating birds like bluebirds and swallows, they were actually less likely to carry pathogens. So that's cool. That was our first indicator of like, okay, there might be some different risks from different species. The other thing that we got really interested in is what happens once a bird poops with E. coli in that poop. Does it survive in bird poop? How long does it survive? We didn't really know. So we had to do some experiments where we would grow E. coli in the lab. In this case, we used a non-pathogenic strain because we would then collect bird feces from a bunch of different bird species that we were capturing and trying to figure out. So we have different kinds of species we're testing here. We would inoculate it with the E. coli at known amounts, and then we would put it back out in the field. And this is at the student farm at UC Davis. So obviously we don't want to put out pathogenic E. coli all over the farm that we're using to grow produce. So we would then like leave it on different kinds of things, on like lettuce, on soil, on plastic, come back at set times and quantify how much E. coli was remaining. And we found that survival was much higher on lettuce than on the plastic or on the soil. That makes sense. Lettuce is sort of cooler and more humid. It doesn't dry out as fast as in plastic or in soil. But really importantly, it was the size of the poop that mattered. That was the most important thing that came out. The size of the poop mattered, not actually which bird was pooping, but how much of it there was. So we could actually look at that. We had, for this experiment, we had bluebirds and turkeys. Turkeys obviously have much bigger poops than bluebirds, but we could take turkey poop and we could subset it down to the same size as bluebird poop. And if they're the same size, it didn't matter. If they're different sizes, you can see here on the x-axis, we have the number of days in the field. On the y-axis, we have the likelihood of detecting any E. coli at all after it being in the field after those days. You can see a big poop, 4.75 grams, the average size of a turkey poop, that is pretty likely to still be detected, at least some E. coli after 30 days. For the juvenile poop of a turkey, so like an adolescent bird will poop a little bit smaller, that decays a little bit more. And then for songbird size, so either 0.03, 0.06 grams, the size of a bluebird, the size of a white-crowned sparrow, that decays quite rapidly, right? And if we care not just about whether we detect E. coli at all, but look at the fraction remaining, the fraction remaining just plummets really rapidly. Here you can see the percent remaining. It's more for the turkeys, obviously, but you're nearly, with 0.001% remaining of the E. coli within a couple days, right? So why am I so fixated on all this and survival? Well, farmers are told to apply these no harvest buffers around wildlife feces. They can't do this in practice for all the bird poop because we've assessed, more than 100 transects. We're walking along looking to see how common bird poop is on farms, and we find that about 10% of their fields, 10% of the 1 meter square quadrants we look at have bird feces. So that would mean farmers would not harvest 10% of their fields if they were in a lettuce farm. And actually on strawberries, it would be 50% of their farms, right? Bird poop is really common there. So they're told to do this. They can't do this. They'll do it probably around like larger poops from like deer and stuff. But by our calculations, if we were to ignore the small poops, the ones that are less than 0.15 grams that had a really low probability of survival, and just ignore that small poop on soil, even, allowing it to be not harvested if it's on the crop, that would reduce the acreage affected from 10% to 2.7%. So a really big, dramatic reduction in terms of that impact on the farmer. All right, so we've been spending some time thinking about birds and poop and pathogens and how birds could contaminate our produce, but birds do other things on farms. And so we had this really big project. This was some project led by my postdoc, my former postdoc, Alyssa Olympi, who's actually worked, I think, with SFBBO a bit too over the years. And Alyssa worked with me looking on strawberries, and we thought not only would birds, potentially contaminate strawberries, but they might like to eat them just like we do. They're delicious. But birds might also eat the bugs that eat the strawberries. They might eat the primary pest of strawberry, the Lygus hesperus bug. But it might even be more complicated than that because birds might not differentiate between a good bug and a bad bug. They might also eat the big-eyed bugs that in turn eat the Lygus hesperus, that in turn eat the berry yields. That's known as intra-guild predation. That just means they're disrupting pest control. So they could do all those things. So we worked across 20 different organic strawberry farms. We had these farms that varied in terms of like how much habitat surrounded them within a kilometer. Some of them were in these really, monoculture landscapes. Some of them were in really diverse landscapes with lots of habitat around them. They also independently varied in terms of their local diversity. Are they growing multiple crops? Do they have hedgerows and flower strips, or do they not, right? And then we went out to these places and we caught a bunch of birds. We set up a bunch of mist nets. We'd catch some birds, take them out of the nets, just like you guys do, put them in their bags, in these sterilized cloth bags. And as you guys might know, when you catch a bird and you put it in your bag and bring it back to the banding station, and you look inside your bag, what do you find? You find poop. And for us, that's exactly what we wanted, right? That's our treasure trove. That's what we wanted. So we were collecting poop. We could then sequence that poop and look to see, are there foodborne pathogens in there, like the E. coli and salmonella? What are they eating? Are they eating insects? What kind of insects? What kind of plants? Are they eating our crops? We had 1,000 feces we collected from about 50 different species. All right. So how does habitat around the farm affect food safety to start with, right? Well, first of all, we looked at more than 10,000 strawberries. The feces only touched 2 of them. So you can be confident to say that most of your strawberries have not been touched by bird poop. Of course, irrigation could spread it around and things like that. Still, what's our positivity in this data set compared to that big one I talked about before? 0.1% for pathogenic E. coli, only 1 bird, no salmonella, and Campylobacter was even rarer, 3.6%. And we found that as you increase the amount of habitat around the farm field, actually the probability of carrying Campylobacter went down. So farmers that had more habitat around, less likely to have birds with Campylobacter, which is great. What about what birds are eating? All right, what about that? Well, we were rejoicing to find out that all of these species pictured here, you might recognize a bunch of them and some others, all of them eat strawberry's primary pest, this Lygus hesperus. We found the DNA of this pest in all of these birds. Yes, birds are doing good. Wonderful. Wait a second. We also found that every single one of them had strawberry DNA in their poop. And all of them also had beneficial bug DNA in all of their poop at least once. So they're doing everything. Every one of these bird species is doing all of these things. All right. What about like on farms that have more or less habitat? What happens to the relative balance of what they're eating? Well, we can look at that. And we find that on farms without habitat around them, birds were tending to eat more strawberries, tending to eat more beneficial bugs, and more pest bugs. On farms with surrounding habitat, they were often spending more time potentially in that habitat and eating less of all of those 3 things. And we could actually validate some of the DNA-based measures by looking for incidents of bird damage. We would call this flick damage. Birds do this thing where they peck at the strawberries and they flick the seeds around on the plastic mulch here. And so we could kind of quantify that. And we find that, yeah, as you increase the amount of habitat around the farm field, you see a lower probability of birds damaging strawberries, engaging in this flick damage. So birds are kind of doing less on these farms if there's more habitat around. But that still doesn't tell us whether the birds are good or whether the birds are bad, and how good they are and how bad they are on the relative on these farms that have habitat versus don't. And to get at that, we need to do an experiment. We need to exclude the birds, prevent them from eating the strawberries, and see what happens, right? So we built these cages around strawberry plants that would let the bugs in, but not let the birds in. We had 14 farms. We had 3 pairs of cages and then these open frame controls, which we would compare. We would monitor them for berry damage and insect abundance weekly. Did that in the early season and in the late season. We found that insects damaged way more berries than birds. Insects way more of a problem than birds. Nonetheless, the net effect of birds was slightly negative. Having birds around reduced farmer yields by about 3.5%. And this is likely due to birds both eating the strawberries and consuming these beneficial bugs. But what's really cool, and the last kind of thing I'll say today, is that we can use our models to compare how that differs on farms managed in different ways. So here's a farm with habitat around it. If we zoomed out, we'd see a lot more habitat in the landscape. You can see that across this farm, birds are having a slight negative effect. It's kind of in this, greenish, yellowish area of the cost impact being, maybe $1 or less per meter squared of birds in terms of reducing that strawberry yield. Here's a farm without habitat. You can see along the edges of the farm that we see a big decline in kind of yields, a big increase in costs. We're seeing birds like these house finches coming on and just hammering, eating a lot of strawberries. In the middle of the fields, we had swallows flying around and actually doing more benefits than harms, all right? What's cool, though, is we can kind of look at counterfactuals. What if we were to take this farm that had very little / no habitat surrounding it and plant a ton of habitat, make it into this farm? Well, if you went from 0% to 50% habitat, you'd actually see a 25% decline in costs associated with birds. Conversely, if we were to deforest this landscape around this farm, we would see a 75% increase in costs. So the surrounding habitat is actually mitigating the costs associated with these wild birds. Okay, so I know we covered a bunch of stuff today. So to sum up, what did we learn? Well, we started off in Costa Rica. We learned that lots of different kinds of birds can thrive on farms. There are diverse bird communities on farms in Costa Rica and actually around here in California as well. However, those birds are different than the ones in forests, and a lot of the ones of conservation concern are more forest restricted. So we need to keep that in mind. Looking forward, we know that climate change might favor these agricultural species over the forest species in the tropics. However, nonetheless, around us, at least in the United States and in California, we're seeing these heat waves in agriculture that might be reducing bird reproduction. And with respect to California and having birds on the farm, we find that this widespread practice of removing habitat is not improving food safety. It is increasing bird damage to strawberries. We also find that pathogens in birds are pretty dang rare, and that these small insect-eating birds are relatively low risk. So putting out your nest boxes is probably not a big deal from a food safety perspective. All right, so first, few thanks to the many field and lab assistants that helped in all this work. We've had a lot of co-authors and students. I've mentioned a few people throughout the presentation, but there's more. Really importantly, I work in private lands. I work with farmers a lot, and I am indebted to them for letting me work with them alongside them on their lands. And so really important to acknowledge them. We've had a bunch of funders, NSF, USDA, other ones as well. Thank you guys for listening, and I will take any questions.
That was really fantastic, Daniel. So incredibly interesting and so relevant and compelling. So if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat, or if they feel they want to unmute themselves, they can go ahead and ask a question. I know I have a few questions, but I first want to open up to other people if others have questions they want to ask. Well, maybe I'll go ahead and ask my question, which is, how have you shared this research and information with private landowners, with industry, with regulators, and what's the response you're getting?
Do you mean the California stuff on the food safety? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I think specifically that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a classic question I always get on this. Yeah. So I published that first study showing that habitat removal was ineffective, and I was really naive and thought we solved the problem, right? Like, hey, this is a costly practice. It's costly ecologically, it's costly economically of like removing all the habitat. We're done, right? And I was totally wrong. We published it. We put out, press releases. We talked to growers and things, and I've been chipping away at this for like the better part of almost a decade at this point. And this is a practice that's still ongoing. Why? It's extremely hard to get the buyers in the room. I can talk to farmers all day long, and every one of them, maybe not everyone, the vast majority of them will see this, totally buy it. They bought it from the beginning. They never thought that these were effective practices, and yet they're forced to do it by their buyers, right? And worse, the buyers are competing over food safety standards, and for that reason are not making them transparent and not releasing them and don't want to have conversations with us. There's all these liability concerns. Getting them in the room has been horrible. So I've done lots of things. We've done like lots of sort of like general outreach. We've done lots of meetings. I've testified before the Water Control Board in Monterey. I've met with attorneys, and yeah, it's tricky. I will say though, for the first time in years, I'm beginning to feel a little optimism in that there's a group of lots of farmers and other industry, like really kind of powerful industry folks, like in big organizations that you guys would have heard of, that have all really gotten behind this and have created this coalition, this consortium that is coming together. They actually had another meeting yesterday I was a part of, which are trying to get everyone together, get the science together, bring it, and basically present a unified front to the big corporation buyers and be like, you guys are ridiculous. This is not effective. Let's stop. So I think there's movement. I think this is the way to do it if it's going to work, but we'll see.
It sounds like you're doing the right thing with what I was going to say is you need kind of someone to get behind you and do some sort of activism and some public relation campaign and put it to the public. And so there's some questions in the chat. I just wanted to kind of ask a big question that maybe you can share information with me later so I can share it with everybody tomorrow when I send the email. But the big question is, how can people support what you have found here and the changes that you might suggest to happen or that the data suggests should happen? We have a very active community here, and so how can people help you with that? And if you want to share that information with me later and I can share that with everybody, that would be great.
I mean, like there's a million of these kinds of projects going on in our lab. And we can always use more money to support our students and get more stuff done. So there's that way. I think kind of just thinking about these kinds of things, what you can do in your backyards. I mean, what a theme here is that there's a lot of scope for conserving wildlife alongside people, right? So you guys all know this by creating wildlife-friendly habitat in your yards. It's also possible to do this in agricultural settings. Thinking about what's going to be happening with climate change and providing some shade and thinking about this microclimate stuff might matter looking forward. So I think some of that matters as well. And, you saw today what we could do with some of the citizen science stuff that's out there. So contributing to efforts like that is really useful. So I think there's ways you can contribute your time, your labor, and then also, of course, money too always works too.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have some questions in the chat. Cameron says, I know you mentioned certain farms like coffee plantations, strawberry farms, and sugarcane. Is there certain types of farms where it might be difficult to implement native habitat for birds?
Oh yeah, totally. Cool. And good to see Cameron. Cameron was actually an undergrad in our major, and so I know Cameron super well. Um, yeah, um, I think different farms pose different challenges, and there are different there's sort of like inherent birdiness of different crops. Coffee is incredibly birdy. We all hear about shade-grown coffee and bird-friendly coffee, and it's true that like that kind of coffee, has really big benefits for birds. But my little secret to you guys is I can go to a sun coffee plantation in Costa Rica and catch ridiculous concentrations of birds as well. It's certainly better in the shade grown, but coffee is a really birdy crop, right? Other ones that are nuked with pesticides and stretching off as far as the eye can see, like sugarcane's harder, right? And so you got to think about the scale of the operation. If they're small family farmers, if they're diverse, they can also do a lot of these things of like these hedgerows and plantings and organic stuff. If it's a large corporate farm, then you got to attack it through other ways. You got to like kind of move the needle a little bit, maybe hedgerows along the edges, maybe thinking about flower strips, maybe making sure they are keeping their habitat and the landscape around them. So it's really dependent on the scale of the operation and, yeah, on the crop you're growing as well.
Thank you. We also have a question. Have you done any analysis on bird damage in vineyards in the Napa Valley for vineyards with
Yeah.
woodlands?
Yeah, totally. So we have a really big vineyard project right now, as I mentioned. It's actually a pest control project. And we have our first year of data, and we're spinning up the second year right now. Um, we're primarily focused, and it was all written about birds sort of eating bugs and controlling vineyard pests. But we also recognize that birds can be pests of vineyards themselves. Last year, we did a bunch of like grape surveys towards the end of the season, and we got actually really low damage from birds. It was less than 1% grape damage, and we surveyed so many grapes. But we was just talking to farmers today, and they were saying that last year was just like the weirdest year, and it really was a weird year. And it was weird because it was so wet before, and then it was relatively cool, and so the like harvest happened like super. Everything was like a little bit delayed, and the bird damage just never came. And they were saying that this year was just way different than everything else. Unfortunately, we're not probably going to do another big bird damage survey this year. It wasn't within the scope of our grant. We're doing mostly on what birds are eating and how to recruit them and focusing more on insect eating birds. But yeah, at least last year we did all that work and we showed really not a big effect of the woodland at all on damage. Our preliminary models say that, and it was all really, really low damage.
Great, thank you. And so we have another question here that I actually was wondering as well. Looking at alternative solutions to these problems around E. coli, is there a way that farmers can just focus on cleaning their bagged lettuce and spinach better and just ignore the birds' pathogens?
Yeah, you can't just wash E. coli off, sadly. So while it's great to wash your produce for like pesticide residues and other things, that's not going to work for E. coli. There's a ton of research focusing on food safety issues and solving them at every stage of the supply chain. It's a huge industry focus, right? I see all of that in the kinds of grants that I get working on this. So it's not like they're only focused on birds, they're focused on the whole industry changed as a result of food safety stuff. But it's not as simple as simply washing it, and there's a lot of post-harvest stuff that is focused on, but the pre-harvest stuff matters too. So sadly, yeah, you can't just wash it.
It's good to know. Another question is looking at other news stories we've heard. For instance, Chipotle got rid of lettuce.
Yeah.
Is E. coli, is the source of this often from birds?
No, I mean, like that's my feeling of it is that birds don't really matter from the foodborne pathogen perspective. There's only been one foodborne disease outbreak ever conclusively attributed to birds. It was a pea field in Alaska, and it was migratory sandhill cranes that had contaminated the pea field with Campylobacter. No E. coli or Salmonella outbreak has ever been conclusively tied to birds. In fact, the E. coli outbreak in 2006, everyone points to the pigs, but there was also E. coli in the water and in the soil. So it didn't necessarily come from the pigs. We know that the birds can carry it at extremely low rates. We know that they come on farms. We know that they poop. We know it can survive, especially in large poop. But when you multiply all those probabilities together, it's really low. So I think birds are really a low food safety concern. And that's kind of one of the theses of the research we're putting together.
Excellent. Thank you. We have someone here saying they'd love to volunteer their vineyard, in which they've planted over 1,000 native plants and dozens of bluebird and owl boxes for you to associate.
Oh,
If you need more Napa vineyards to analyze, and I can connect you with that person as well.
yeah, we have a full suite of 20 vineyards that we've been working with over last year and this year. But yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. There's actually some chance that I think we're fairly tapped out for this year, but we might be able to come out. We'll see. But maybe especially if you have owl boxes, there's an owl box project that we've partnered with too. So let me know the name of your vineyard, and yeah, we can connect and see.
Great. Carolyn says there is a certification for coffee that is grown in a bird-friendly manner. Could something similar be created for other crops like berries, greens, etc.?
Yeah, people are talking about that. There's bird-friendly. I know Audubon's been doing some like grassland-friendly beef stuff. People have been talking about it with vineyards, actually, bird-friendly wine for a while, but hasn't been done yet. I think it could be done. It would be nice to be done as well. Yeah, so I think you could think about that and then have the consumer pressure as well.
Wonderful. That was a fantastic presentation, and thank you so much. So thanks everyone for coming. We really appreciate all your participation and involvement in what we're doing here at SFBBO. So Daniel, thanks again for your talk, and thanks everyone for joining us.
SFBBO is a nonprofit. With your support, we will continue to inform decision makers, inspire people to act, and involve diverse communities in our work. Please visit our website to learn more and get involved today.